All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Tonight, Verified will be hosting the second town hall in our virtual National Summer Town Hall series. So last month, we heard from legislators across the Southeast, and tonight we will hear from state legislators in the Mid and Southwest. My name is Kristen Wilder, Senior Political Manager with Verified, and your moderator for the evening. So state legislative sessions across the country are pretty unique because there are states that are in the legislature year round and states where legislatures only convene for part of the year. However, each state has seen similar bills come up with issues that have been debated on with legislative sessions across the country coming to an end or taking a break. A number of issues have been debated on that we want to touch on during this time together. So I share the same sentiments that I echoed last month. The role the state legislators play is so important because they have the opportunity to pass legislation that can improve the lives of individuals, or to combat legislation that is harmful. In fact, last week's Supreme Court decision highlighted just how important state legislatures are because they are responsible for redistricting, for example. 2023 legislative sessions are important as they work to pass bills and slate voters ahead of the 2024 election, where many state legislators will also be back on the ballot. So tonight we will highlight the work that has been done and some of the work that we can expect to see in 5 states. We are joined by Representative Laura Tarrick in Arizona, Senator Dallas Harris of Nevada, Representative Jessica Miranda of Ohio, Representative Valdenia Wynn in Kansas, and Representative Darren Madison Jr. of Wisconsin. So we have a lot of issues to cover, so we are going to go ahead and get started. So since 2020, conservative legislative majorities have been on a mission to sort of legislate and pander to big lie conspiracies. Many state legislators do not actually believe there was widespread election fraud or that any election was stolen. But across the country, we can continue to see actions that aim to please those who believe otherwise. And so this year, the expulsion of state legislatures have been a topic of discussion, especially with the expulsion of the 2 state representatives in Tennessee for their protest for gun reform. However, Arizona also expelled a member of their state legislature this year. So Representative Tarrick, what were the circumstances surrounding this expulsion? And what are the dangers of sharing big lie, misinformation or disinformation?
So the circumstances surrounding the expulsion of Liz Harris from the Arizona State House of Representatives were such that she served on the House Elections Committee, as did I, and she had advocated very strongly for a joint Senate-House elections hearing where she wanted to be able to present information that she felt supported the big lie. When I heard about that, almost immediately, I said, I won't be participating in that. I won't be attending that. I don't want to be a party to platforming these lies. My Democratic colleagues in both the House and the Senate shared that sentiment. And so we boycotted that hearing. And I'm very glad we did. Because what was presented at the very end of that hearing, she brought on a woman who offered completely unsubstantiated claims that our Governor Katie Hobbs, our Democratic governor, our Democratic Secretary of State, our Republican Speaker of the House, and the LDS Church were all laundering money for the Sinaloa drug cartel. It was an incredibly shocking moment. And they brought the hearing to a close after that, and she was brought up on an ethics violation because there was some information that they received that she knew what was going to be shared in that hearing and platformed it anyway. So she went before the ethics committee, and they found her to be in violation of House rules, that she had engaged in disorderly conduct. So the Republicans actually made a motion to expel her from the body. And what I'll say about that vote, I was a very comfortable yes vote on that. However, it was an incredibly difficult day. No one goes down there expecting or wanting to expel another duly elected representative. However, the motion passed, and she was expelled from the body. An interesting aftermath to that is in Arizona, when there's a vacancy, the Board of Supervisors chooses three. There are three people who move forward based on what the precinct committee people in their district vote on. And then of those three names, the three that are put forward, the Board of Supervisors selects the replacement. And Ms. Harris put her name in again. So there was the potential that, and she was voted through. She was the top vote getter in her district among the PCs, among the precinct committee people. And so there was a chance that she would have been immediately returned to the body. That did not happen. Someone else was appointed in her place, which, I was pleased to see that, to be frank with you. And I think this speaks to the danger of platforming these lies, because they were used to really try and make fundamental changes to the way that Arizona votes. So Ms. Harris either sponsored or supported bills that would have ended voting centers, ended early voting, ended machine tabulation, and ended mail-in voting, which 80% of our state, 80% of Arizona votes by mail. We've done it for years. It's a system that we know and trust because our elections are safe and secure. So it was a wild way. This is my very first session. It was certainly a wild way to get started, but I'm pleased that we are not furthering these lies, at least in that regard. There's a long way to go. There are certainly other members who support those bills, and it's a danger to the health of our democracy. So moving forward, I hope that we can have better conversations about access to the ballot box and supporting the free, secure, safe elections that we know we have.
Thank you, Representative Tarek. On a lighter note, Wisconsin has seemingly turned a new leaf when it comes to campaign and elections legislation. Assemblyman Darren Madison, what are some of the bills that have been introduced to strengthen election administration in Wisconsin?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Hello?
can. Yes.
Got you. So there have been several efforts to increase the integrity of our Wisconsin election commissions, as well as ensure that we provide folks access to mail-in ballots, especially through the pandemic. And even now, there was a few efforts to try and prevent folks um, from turning in mail-in ballots. But thanks to under our governor, we were able to block those efforts. Additionally, we do, but additionally, we've been doing a lot to ensure that folks have access to the information that they need to be able to fully participate in our elections, and the integrity of our elections are honored. Though there have been folks on our state election commission that have actually patted themselves on their back when it comes to the integrity of our elections, and in actually preventing folks from voting. In our past election cycle, this past fall, particularly in the city I call home, um, there was election commissioner Spindell, who toted approximately 26,000 votes that were prevented um, from being counted in the fall election. But we have been working diligently to ensure that we pass legislation that makes sense. And surprisingly, there is some bipartisan support for some of these bills.
Thank you, Assemblyman Madison. I'm going to pivot. I saw a tweet the other day that talked about Governor Joe Lombardo, who is the governor of Nevada. But I think few people around the country know that in the beginning of the Nevada legislative session, he actually proposed a law that would make some changes to the way elections work in Nevada. This particular bill did not actually go anywhere. But Senator Harris, can you sort of summarize what his plans were? And then pivot to just talk about some of the things that the legislature in Nevada have been able to get through.
Sure. So Senate Bill 405 was the typical, I think, Republican response to the kind of fake idea that there's a lot of fraud in our elections. It was stricter voter ID requirements. In Nevada right now, we have universal mail, vote by mail. So everyone gets one without having to request it. Of course, if you'd like to vote in person, you can. That's still an option. This bill would have scaled that back and only sent ballots to folks who requested it. So it really was trying to pull back a lot of the progress that I think Democrats have made on this issue in the last 8 years. Nevada is one of the friendliest states to vote. And the reason why the bill didn't go anywhere is because our Democratic legislature was going to make sure that we kept it that way. Just a little bit of context for folks. In the last 2 legislative sessions, Democrats have had a trifecta. This is the first session since I've been around that we have now a split government where Democrats control both houses, but we have a Republican governor. And so we wanted to make sure that we were very clear about our values, and that includes voting rights for everyone. So instead of restricting voting rights, we expanded voting rights. One example is expanding voting rights in our tribal areas. We also put forward and passed legislation that would encourage folks to be able to vote from jail, right? They still have that right. It hasn't been taken away, and they should be able to do that just like every other American. And so while the governor was moving in one direction, the legislature moved in another, and I'm fully expect him to sign those pieces of legislation.
Thank you, Senator Harris. I'm going to pivot now to talk about a really important topic. Since the reversal of the Roe decision, abortion access has been a really big topic across the country. And Representative Miranda in Ohio, you all have a ballot measure that will be on the ballot this year that would make it more difficult to amend your state constitution. So can you tell us more about this ballot measure and sort of the motivation behind bringing it forward?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me today. And here in Ohio, the majority party, which is comprised of the Republican Party, and they have a supermajority in all 3 sections of our government, unfortunately, they are obsessed with telling women and pregnant people what they can and cannot do with their bodies. If you recall, we had passed a 6-week abortion ban way before it became popular for all other states to start passing their 6-week abortion bans. And thank goodness this was held up in our courts and wasn't allowed to go into effect prior to the Dobbs decision being pulled down. Since the Dobbs decision has been pulled down, the people of Ohio have been loud and clear where they stand with their support on reproductive freedom. And they have bound together with physicians across the state to put a ballot measure on the November ballot this year to protect reproductive freedom here in Ohio. And when my colleagues across the aisle saw that happening, they seized their moment to introduce a resolution to raise the way in which we access our Constitution as Ohioans. So they have reinstated a August election that they just voted to get rid of back in lame duck session in December to put forth a very costly and a very anti-democratic issue, which is going to be issue 1 here in August in Ohio, and it will raise the threshold in which people can change Ohio's constitution and access their constitution to 60%. So it's quite a interesting and obvious way in which they're trying to stop the reality of a reproductive freedom ballot issue coming in November, and reinstated something that they literally just got rid of in December to do so in a August special election where we know turnout is abysmal. And we are very, very hopeful that all of us who have bound together to fight against this are going to come out in droves in August and vote no in August to vote this down and make sure that Ohio voters have access to their constitution.
Thank you, Representative Miranda. I've definitely been following this issue. I know earlier this week, the Republicans were actually ordered to sort of change the language for the ballot measure since the original language was going to be misleading. So yeah, we'll definitely keep following this issue. And so, like Arizona, Kansas also has a Democratic governor, but a conservative majority in the state legislature. However, unlike Arizona, conservatives in Kansas have the ability to override vetoes. Representative Nguyen, what anti-abortion legislation has been introduced in Kansas, and how are you all sort of have been navigating that?
Well, thank you. Likewise. And Kansas, surprised everyone last August when over 600,000 Kansans came out to affirm the right to reproductive care. And it's estimated that over about 70% of Kansans still believe that women and their families are in a better position to make that decision than politicians. So that's the baseline, and that's the atmosphere in Kansas. And while, yes, we have Republican control in both houses, and this session especially, a couple of bills that have implications were vetoed, and they were overridden by one vote. But for the most part, that vote in August, that I hope occurs the same in Ohio, put a chill on the Republicans in Kansas. And so what they introduced this session, no, they did not come back with an amendment. They knew that was not going to work. They really didn't have the creativity to get the language for what they wanted. And they're still, while the 600,000 and the 70% oppose any restriction, the Kansas Supreme Court has already affirmed we have the right. There still is that strong anti-abortion sentiment. But this session, they could only muster up a little creativity. One was a part of an education bill that is so subtle you would miss it if you didn't read closely the language. Within the education bill is a medical loan OBGYN program, so that if you're going into special, practice OBGYN, and you take the medical loan for your med school, those years that you got the funding, you could not perform an abortion or work in a facility that performed abortions. So on the one hand, the medical students will say, I'm going to take the money. I need the loan. And I will then, if I choose to go down that path, I know that I will have a waiting period. But the hurtful aspect of it is that you're restricting the number of trained OBGYN physicians. And in many parts of Kansas, we have deserts. Our hospitals have folded up. So that was one, and it's somewhat minor, but still it was that we are going to get something anti-abortion. Second bill that was more dramatic in the manner in which it was presented, House Bill 2264 defined abortion like we don't know how it's defined, but it addressed more the medication abortion, and it spoke to reversals. And the main part of the bill, which the topic is traumatic, but this bill was so concerned about notification, that you must notify the woman who was contemplating an abortion that part of the medication can be reversed. And they put in penalties, they put in restrictions, and it was the manner in which they debated reversal of abortions was so painful. More so than the content of the bill, to tell you the truth. And then finally, the majority party put in a section that was called Born Alive, that during an abortion, if something should happen and the child is born alive, then the restriction was to place on the medical workers the requirement to transport the infant to a hospital to care for it while may have been born alive, it may not have lived 30 seconds, 5-10 minutes, and heavy penalties. So on the one hand, these were bills that weren't the complete ban. They still were in the sentiment of anti-abortion, but that's as far as they could muster up the votes, because they know there is this 70% sentiment that don't touch this subject.
Thank you, Representative Nguyen. So June is Pride Month. It's a time for everyone to celebrate and support those who identify as members of the LGBTQ plus community. Unfortunately, there have been a number of legislation introduced across the country that is actually harmful to members of the LGBT community. In fact, according to the ACLU, there have been close to 500 anti-LGBT bills this year alone. So with that being said, we're going to talk about some of that legislation, but we're also going to get into the response to it and the way the community has really been pulling together to support one another. So Representative Tarek, despite having a Democratic governor, the Arizona State Legislature has introduced and passed a few anti-LGBT bills. Can you describe some of these bills and the importance of preventing a conservative majority in the state legislature?
Sure. Well, we've seen a number of bills aimed at our LGBTQ plus community, which is especially hurtful and frustrating because the Republicans know that these are all headed for a veto. We've seen bills aimed at criminalizing drag shows, but they're all upsetting, but the ones that have been the most egregious for me have been the bills aimed at our LGBTQ youth. I sit on the House Education Committee, and some of the bills that we've seen come through there would restrict teachers from using accurate pronouns, would force teachers potentially to out students to their parents, and would also legally mandate where our trans students are allowed to use the bathroom at school. And it's just been really heartbreaking to see that. And these are our most vulnerable young people, some of our most vulnerable young people who are at incredibly high risk for suicide, for substance abuse, for homelessness, for violence. And I just find that as a lawmaker, I think one of the most important things that we can do is lead with compassion. And the practical impact of this is the message that it sends to the entire LGBTQ community in our state, that your state government is working to make your lives harder. And everyone deserves to live in authenticity, especially our young people. That's something I believe that we can support and uplift for all of them. And, preventing a conservative majority coming through, we would stop seeing bills like this. We would see bills that affirm gender identity and support our community. And one thing that has been really wonderful to see, when Katie Hobbs was Secretary of State, she hung LGBTQ, trans visibility flags from her office in the executive tower, and they were immediately taken down. Well, now that she is on the top floor of the executive tower as our governor, she proudly hung those flags. They returned for Pride Month, and they are still there. And every day I get to drive into the Capitol and see a governor who supports our LGBTQ community. And we hope very much, and we plan to back that up with a Democratic legislature in 2024.
Thank you. So many states have introduced what have been termed as Parent Bill of Rights. We've seen it here in Georgia and a few southern states, and I know you all have seen these as well. So Representative Miranda, what exactly are these Parent Bill of Rights laws, and what do they aim to do?
Yes, so we have one of those exact laws that has been introduced here in Ohio and unfortunately has already been approved out of committee and is heading to our House floor next Wednesday, And what this would do, it would undermine educators who are trained to teach and care for our children and create very, very confusing guidelines on what is sexuality content, and would literally aim to have teachers out children to their parents and put them in dangerous situations. So, they framed these things as being called the Parents' Bill of Rights, but as we all know here, they are really just anti-LGBTQ legislation aimed at bullying our LGBTQ children. And, it doesn't stop there. We've had our own bathroom ban here in Ohio bill that has been introduced. We have gender affirming care ban that has now been combined with the so-called Enact Women's Sports bill, which is really just keeping children from playing sports and participating in the extracurricular activities they want to be with their friends in school, no matter how they identify. And they've now combined those two horrid bills together, and those will be on our House floor next Wednesday for a vote as well. So it seems that their culture wars never end, and the bullying of LGBTQ children never ends here in Ohio. And we have done everything we can in our power as the super minority to stand up against these bills, including last year in December during Lame Duck. They tried to pass the trans child ban in sports bill, and didn't even read their own bill, apparently, and didn't realize that it had language in there that would allow for genital inspections of young girls. And so we pointed this out on the floor. They passed it anyway, but it went over and died in the Senate chamber because of that heinous language. So it is very, very appalling that these are the kinds of bills they are choosing to uplift and put a platform under during June, Pride Month. And we need everyone here in Ohio to stand up against all of these hateful bills and all of this hate and vitriol that has spewed at bullying and attacking our LGBTQ children.
Thank you, Representative Miranda. Representative Nguyen, there have also been a number of bills introduced that were introduced during the Kansas legislative session. Can you get into what some of these bills were?
Yes, thank you. And very similar. I echo everything that has been said. The hate was clear, and what makes it as painful as others, two members of our caucus are LGBT, and last year we had a transgender, and the bullying, what you would think, I think the representative from Arizona said, we're supposed to be examples, and we're not. But pass one Fairness in Women's Sports Act, just to tag along with the national fear and fear mongering of transgender participating in sports. House Bill 2238 was identified, labeled the Fairness in Women's Sports Act, requires interscholastic, intercollegiate, intramural, club athletic teams or sports that are sponsored by public and private schools to have either male or female or co-ed. And it was vetoed, but it was again overridden in the House 84-40, just by one vote, in the Senate 28-12. But that it in essence says, says to transgender kids, they're invisible, and that it probably, and they knowingly, it discriminates, and it probably violates Title IX, and that they passed also, and I say they because none of our Democrats voted for these bills, except for one on overriding the veto, but they passed a Women's Bill of Rights that sounds so noble, but that it defines sex biologically. And so this inadvertently says you're either male or female. And so it just totally ignores the possibility, the individuality, and that it doesn't provide a Bill of Rights, or it's not even about women. But it passed, and Kansas, I'm not proud of Kansas in this category, but it's as narrow as and discriminatory as it has been on many issues.
Thank you, Representative Wynn. I know Assemblyman Madison, Wisconsin has also seen a number of these bills. What's really interesting is that a representative from Florida last month spoke to whether or not constituents were calling and asking for these sort of bills that play onto culture wars. So can you tell us more about the bills that have been introduced in Wisconsin? Also, just share if these are the type of bills that voters are actually asking for.
Yeah, absolutely. So there has been a bill introduced. Well, the governor the governor tried to ban conversion therapy at the state level, and Republicans used a um, procedural motion to prevent the governor from doing that. And it is, though it still allows local municipalities to maintain their bans at the state level. We cannot do anything about it, and they've because of this procedure, they can re-up every 2 years, right? So it's kind of we're kind of in a limbo state as it relates to conversion therapy, which is a heinous practice that only creates more disparities for LGBTQ young people. There's also, our Speaker of the House um, has made it very clear that he's going to reintroduce a bill to prevent um, trans young people from participating in athletic activities. And there's so many other heinous bills that folks on the other end of the aisle are ramping up to and beginning to circulate to create harms for these young people. Whether it's in schools, whether it's in um, the amount of the books that our young people have access to, which Florida's already moved in that direction. Um, we are on our end of the aisle. We are preparing a strong defense, and our governor is prepared to veto every single bill that creates harms for queer and non-binary young people. Um, but no one's asking for this. As we think about the young people in the state of Wisconsin, everyone talks about how, and we were literally in session to 10 p.m. last night, talking about how every young person should be valued in this state. And folks on the other end of the aisle were, toting that as they were, the legislature, both the lower house and the upper house passed a piece of legislation that expanded parental school choice. Um, but in that same vein, passed legislation like this that prevents our young people from being protected. And our residents have made it very clear. I've seen parents emailing my office, showing up in the Capitol, emailing my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, telling them this is not what our kids need, and it's not what's best for our young people. So we need to do better, and we're trying to do better in Wisconsin. But simultaneously, folks are trying to ensure worse things happen.
Thank you. So there is a bright side, a lighter note. In Nevada, Senator Harris, Nevada actually has a newly formed LGBT caucus in their state legislature. So why is it so important to have this caucus, and how can people support the LGBTQ plus community as conservatives continue to wage these just ridiculous culture wars?
Yeah, so I think everyone on here spoke a lot about why it's important that we have an LGBTQ caucus, right? There is I don't know how to explain it, right? It's an onslaught. There's a coordinated attack across the country on LGBTQ and trans children, right? And adults. And so it's really important at this time that Nevada get together and protect the ground that we've made recently. Nevada was not always an LGBTQ friendly state. I remember when I was in high school, before I could vote, on our Constitution, we actually passed the definition of marriage between a man and a woman. Since then, we have repealed that and actually have been one of the first states to put into the Constitution affirmatively the right for LGBTQ folks to get married. And so there are a lot of good things that are happening. We need to make sure that we continue to make that progress going forward. Another great thing about LGBTQ plus caucuses, LGBTQ plus folks, is that their issues are everyone's issues, right? So I was able to do a lot of HIV modernization. But HIV does not just affect the LGBTQ community. With that, we opened up testing for STDs and other things to attack communicable diseases and treat them more like public health issues and less like crimes, right? That benefits everybody. As to the second part of your question, I think, Representative Wynn and Representative Tarek and Representative Miranda, they were all great examples of how to be allies, right? I don't know if any of you are LGBTQ, but the passion that you feel and your desire to stand up for folks who may or may not be like you, that's what true allyship looks like, right? You need to be just as enraged as if you were directly affected. Talk to your other straight friends. Have those hard conversations when you hear folks say something that is a little outdated, right? If you confront it and you keep fighting, then that's what allyship, I think, really looks like.
Thank you so much. That was a great response. And I love what you said is that LGBTQ plus issues are everyone's issues. And I think we all know that when they come for one, they will absolutely come for all of us. So like I mentioned, we have been noticing this trend of conservatives launching these absurd culture wars. And to the Assemblyman Madison's point, voters are not calling and asking for these things. They're asking about affordable housing. They are asking about having their educations fully funded. They're asking about issues that will really, help and improve their lives. They are not asking for these absurd bills that Republicans have continued to put to the forefront of legislative sessions. And so let me be clear, like these culture wars are extremely dangerous. I believe earlier this week was the anniversary of the shooting in Florida a few years ago. And so we want to highlight some of these changes, but we also want to highlight how we can rally around members of the LGBTQ plus community. And as Senator Harris said, be good allies and advocate with them against the ongoing discrimination. And so to pivot again, speaking of, the Pulse nightclub shooting, the anniversary was a few days ago, but this country actually has had a number of mass shootings this year. But unfortunately, we have seen very little done to address this ongoing epidemic in our country. So Representative Miranda, in Ohio, you all have House Bill 51 that was introduced that I guess sort of aims to bolster Second Amendment rights. So can you tell us more about, what this bill will do and like what the possible impact could be if it continues to advance through your state legislature?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for highlighting gun violence and gun safety measures that are unfortunately absent in terms of bills that move in the Ohio State House. House Bill 51 is a literal copy and paste piece of legislation from Missouri's own law. I want to point out two things about House Bill 51. One, Missouri's law that passed just like this one has already been ruled unconstitutional. And two, after Missouri passed its own version, the state saw an uptick in gun violence. And if any of my colleagues here or anyone out there watching has been following what's happened in the Ohio State House over the past couple of years, my Republican colleagues have done literally everything that they can, have passed every piece of legislation that they possibly could to make our state more dangerous and to make our communities less safe with every piece of gun violence legislation that they enact. So they keep following in the steps of some states like Florida. They've gone and passed shoot first, ask questions later bills. They've taken away concealed carry permits. And it is just the all out Wild West here in Ohio. And if they get away with passing House Bill 51, that is quite literally what it will be, because House Bill 51 aims to go against everything the federal government has done, to make gun safety a reality for all of our states. One of those specific things in this bill is that it legalizes the attachments designed to make firearms more deadly and concealable, and that's perfectly legal. So, and that's despite federal law, right? And something else House Bill 51 would do is that anything that federal law would do to keep us and our children more safe, House Bill 51 would block from happening here in Ohio. So everyone else can benefit from federal law that introduces gun safety, but not here in Ohio, because my colleagues are so obsessed with, having guns and making Ohio like the Wild Wild West. And of course, I shouldn't have to point this out because everyone on this call knows this, but these bills, just like House Bill 51 and so many others, make our communities less safe. Not only are they unconstitutional, but they make all of us less safe, and they continually put our children in danger. Because what we should be doing here in Ohio is passing a safe storage law so that we can prevent mass shootings from happening, and we can prevent other gun violence from happening. And it's like every day I wake up and there's another story about a child getting a hold of an unsecured weapon and accidentally shooting themselves or others. And it literally just happened hours ago here in Ohio, about 30 minutes away from my house in New Richmond, Ohio. There was a shooting involving 3 or 4 youths as we know it, and the news is still rolling in and developing. But, it's an all-out free for all, so to speak, in terms of who can get their hands on guns here in Ohio. And we have to do everything in our power to make gun safety laws so that we can keep our children and all of us safe in all of our communities.
Thank you, Representative Miranda. So we are beginning to come to the conclusion of our town hall. There are a lot of issues that, happen or are brought up during your legislative sessions that we weren't able to touch on this evening. But I want to highlight the fact that we are going into a pretty big election year next year, and that can sort of have a lot of influence on the type of legislation that comes up for the remainder of the year or even next year when states enter their regular session. So this is a question to everyone, and we'll start with you, Representative Tarek. But what can voters expect to see come from you all's next legislative sessions, and how can voters support you as you all are on the front lines to combat some of these extreme bills that are being brought to the forefront?
I think the first thing that voters can do is stay informed about what's happening at your state legislatures, stay engaged, and talk to your friends. I mean, that's one of the most powerful things we can do is spread awareness and make sure that everyone is registered to vote, has all the information they need, and is ready to make their voices heard at the ballot box. As far as what I expect we'll hear next session, unfortunately, I think it's going to be much of the same. We passed a bill this year that would have set up a man versus machine count test to see which is faster, counting via machine or counting by hand. And I find that to be an absolutely incredible waste of taxpayer dollars. I can save everyone the suspense. Machine counts are faster and more accurate. And we're going to see a lot more of that. There's a huge, huge push in Arizona to count all of our ballots by hand, which is just totally unworkable from a practical standpoint and will not lead to faster results or accurate results. And then the other thing that we're seeing that's been really disturbing is the attacks on our citizen initiative process, which is enshrined in our state's constitution. We recently, this week, sent a bill directly onto the ballot that would ask voters to restrict their own citizen initiative process, restrict their own powers, and that it would require a certain percentage of signatures from every legislative district in the state, which would have the practical impact of giving one community veto power over our entire state. And these are statewide measures. Everyone has an opportunity to make their voices heard when these come up. So I expect we'll see more of the same, and it will be more important than ever to make sure we're registering voters and providing that information and making sure that everyone knows just what's at stake here and how critical this is for Arizona and for the future of our democracy as a whole.
Thank you, Representative Tarek. Assemblyman Madison, same question for you. What can voters do to support you all as you prepare for your next legislative session?
Yeah, I mean, one, we're still in the smack dab in the middle of session. We are in the point where we're introducing a series of amazing bills. We just had a press conference yesterday talking about a gun safe summer, and trying to introduce legislation that does two things. One, provides universal background checks on every gun sale, and two, temporarily moves the guns out of the homes of folks who are at risk of harming themselves, by partnering with law enforcement, and other necessary stakeholders, so that that person can get the necessary care that they need as well. And we are trying to ensure that we are keeping residents informed about the very bad things that have been happening, in our legislature, and all of the good things. Now, we also in Wisconsin are in a particular position, because of the changing of our Supreme Court, to fix our maps. And if that happens, the next legislative session, um, might look dramatically different. And if that's the case, um, it's time for communities to really push for the bills that they want to see, um, happening, passed in the state of Wisconsin, because as it relates to the folks on my side of the aisle, we are interested in passing bills that are a reflection of the communities that we serve, not a reflection of, the highest bidder at the table. Um, so, staying in touch with your legislator, making sure that you are, following what's happening in the legislature, and if folks have questions, I've answered questions. My office has been really great about, supporting residents throughout the state, and understanding how legislation impacts their individual community, um, so that they can make informed decisions and make sure that their legislator or representative or senator, is doing what's best for all Wisconsin.
Thank you, Representative Nguyen. Same question for you. What do you expect to see, and what can voters do to support you all?
Right. Well, of course, we've adjourned and we don't go back until January. So we have then the luxury, and we should take that as a luxury, of time to get more citizens involved, more citizens registered. We were able to defeat the restrictions that were proposed on mail-in ballots. So that right now that's safe. But I am also ranking on the K-12 budget committee, and vouchers have been introduced 3 years, sessions consistently. They have lost each time, but the low income tax credit, which we call voucher light, has been expanded. So there's still going to be attack on public schools. We are constitutionally funded from lawsuits, but special ed needs to be addressed. There will be some movement to restrict abortion. They just will not back off. They haven't gotten the message. And there are fewer and fewer restrictions on gun ownership. So as Ohio, they passed a bill that requires no permit, takes the cost away. And it's super serious, but probably the biggest attacks will be anti-abortion and vouchers.
Senator Harris, your thoughts?
Yeah, so the state of Nevada is a little bit different than most states. We are one of 4 states in the country that has a legislative session every other year. And so we will not have a legislative session in 24. However, of course, a rotating amount of our state senators will be up for election. We anticipate that Democrats will be able to pick up a 2/3 in the Senate. We currently have one in the Assembly. And so if we can pick that up in the Senate, we'll be able to override any of the Republican governor's vetoes in 2025. The other thing that we're going to be looking out for is the governor is going to be up for election in 2026. And so we'll see how he responds to having a potentially veto-proof Democratic majority in the legislature. I think we're going to just spend a lot of time trying to make sure that veto-proof majority happens, because that type of thing does not just fall into your lap. And so we're going to have to be out knocking doors, educating voters, talking about what we were able to accomplish, and drawing strong contrast between how we govern and how our Republican governor chooses to govern. So that'll be our focus in 24, along, of course, with our United States Senator Jackie Rosen up for re-election as well. So it'll be a hot and heavy election season, hoping to bring us a nice big victory in 2025.
Thank you, Senator Harris. And last but certainly not least, Representative Miranda in Ohio.
Thank you for this question. You know, much like Assemblyman Madison, we are still in the thick of it here in Ohio's session. We have to pass our state biennium budget, which is become very, very difficult. The House and the Senate are not seeing eye to eye on priorities like fully funding children's education and other things, keeping culture wars out of higher ed curriculum, etc. So first and foremost, we have to do that by July 1st. Secondly, it is imperative that we mobilize every single Ohioan to come out and vote no in August on issue 1, because the majority party is trying to make it minority rule here in Ohio and take all of your voting rights away as we speak and while they're doing it. So we do not want minority rule here in Ohio. We want one vote, one person to equal one vote. And so we need everyone to come out and vote no in August special election. And then secondly, much like Senator Harris said, you know, we are looking forward to the cycles in 2024 and 2026. We have a gerrymandering problem here in Ohio. So we have to do something about getting fair maps. And that's a big part of the reason why we don't want to change the threshold and how we have access to our Constitution, because that's how we got ballot initiatives through previously to ensure fair maps. And then Republicans found loopholes around giving us fair maps. And so now we have to make those initiatives stronger. But 2024, we are going to work super hard to keep all of our Democratic seats in the House and the Senate, and hopefully expand those with a fairer map, and keep Senator Sherrod Brown working for us on the federal level of government as well as our Ohio senator, and you know, move on to 2026 and see what we can do about our gubernatorial race. So stay in touch with all of your legislators here in Ohio. Tell them you are absolutely done when you are not asking for these culture war pieces of legislation, and come out and vote no in August so we can keep and make it sure that here in Ohio, one person equals one vote.
I thank you, Representative Miranda, and thank you, and as well, Senator Harris, for highlighting the fact that next year is not just a presidential election year, but there will be a number of state legislative seats on the ballot across the country. And so, you know, we are up against a lot. We are combating a lot, especially you all in the state legislatures, as you see these bills come up. However, we know that when we fight, we win. So there are a lot of community-based organizations like Fair Fight, and a lot of elected officials like you all who are on the front line combating and advocating against some of the more egregious bills, but also working to promote free and fair elections and to promote a safer community for all. So it's really important for everyone watching to tap into a community-based organization in your community, as well as supporting your state legislators as well, and getting involved in this fight with us. It does take all of us, but it is doable. So I want to thank all the panelists for joining us and for sharing your expertise on your states and some of the things that have been happening and the work that you all have been doing. To everyone watching, catch us next month as we will be wrapping up our Summer Town Hall series with state legislators from the South. So good night to everyone.
Good night.